Hey everybody, welcome back. Sorry, it took a little bit to do some uh, Zoom gymnastics, to say the least. Let's wait for a minute or two for people to connect. And then while we are doing that, we can just have a slight open session on introductions from people. And yeah, any folks who haven't had the chance to introduce themselves. I'm seeing Bill on the line here. Bill, do you want to just briefly introduce yourself? Bill Olharan.
We'll see.
Oh,
Yeah, Bill, feel free to accept. I think I've invited you to unmute.
Maybe, I don't know if Bill can hear us. Oh, there we go. Bill, just a quick 1-2 line intro for everybody. I know I put you on the spot suddenly, but Bill, can you hear us?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. Do you want to just introduce yourself briefly, Bill? I know there are a few people that I kind of ping every time when we connect to do quick intros.
Oh, hi. I'm Bill O'Halloran from Fort Collins, Colorado. I'm a retired podiatric foot and ankle surgeon and have an undergraduate degree in zoology. And as you know from your emails, an interest in phytoplankton. So I was put in touch with this through your office, and I'm enjoying it very much. And thank you for welcoming me.
Perfect. Thank you. And then the other person I just want to introduce themselves is Patrick Coyle. Patrick, could you briefly introduce yourself?
Very much. Thank you, Manu. I'm Pat Coyle. I'm with Engineers Without Borders and Rotary, and I'm a big fan of Manu's lab. My son, Scott Coyle, benefited enormously from his experience there. He's now at University of Wisconsin-Madison, along with his wife, setting up their labs and trying to convey this same spirit of curiosity-driven science. So we're huge fans.
And then, Pat, could you describe your work just briefly in Nicaragua?
Sure. We actually, the slide behind me, we're going to be doing a virtual fundraiser next Wednesday evening at 6:30 Pacific time for the whole chapter. We have 7 programs in the San Francisco professional chapter, but in Nicaragua, we're sprinting to wrap up a water supply project for a community of 300 families, about 1,100 people in the central highlands of Nicaragua. And all we have left to do is build our ferrocement storage tank, get the pump in the well, and hook up the power. We've already put in 4.5 kilometers of pipeline with the community, 50 tap stands. So they're really looking forward to having this water there. We hope by Christmas. And in this time of COVID-19, there are some really compelling videos from the community talking about the hazards of having that many people have to go to a central well that they pump by hand, exposing each other. So they're very, very concerned about it. So and we took a box of fold scopes when we went in January. Manu helped us get a box of fold scopes, which didn't get out to people because of coronavirus, but we're going to revive that and get them pushed out into the community because we think could be a very useful science education for young people, and particularly important in being able to see how they can support sort of water and sanitation citizen science. So we'll see. Thank you, Manu.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think I just wanted to mention and bring out these intros just to have people realize that the members that are connecting on an everyday basis and are part and parcel of our community have experiences, all the way from community work to engagement around the world. So please, when on Discord, when you find out, reach out to these individuals. And even if they're not playing an official mentor role for your team, they have all this knowledge that we have just amongst ourselves, and it's important. We will be transitioning essentially after this lecture today's lecture is going to be about community building, but after this lecture, we will really be transitioning into a process focused truly only on making sure we can make the kind of advances that we can make on our class projects. I had a conversation with a few of you over the last few days. It's absolutely stunning, even from where you were when you presented to where the projects are now. And I think for the folks who don't have a mentor assigned as yet officially, and also for mentors who don't have a team or a few teams, hopefully, that they're engaged with, please do let us know on Discord, Slack, or other means so I can make sure that we're making the dots and the connections. I will reach out to a few more mentors to put more things on their plate, primarily from the context of if they have the capacity to engage. And I think at this point, it's very valuable for us to be transitioning into a phase where we can take the breadth of ideas that we have thought about and distill them to the end goal by the end of the class, which will be the final presentation. We want to have quantitatively and analytically proven or disproven your idea. You know, you have to really have something to say, I now know everything that I need to know, that this is something that we're really going to invest in primarily because we have the breadth of work that we have done in the past. So I think if you have, from a scope perspective, if you still have questions, ping me on Discord, and then I'll do one-on-one meetings both this week, next week, and the next week to make sure that teams have a very clear scope in mind. So I want to transition to the topic for today, which is really about community building. And I'm going to do this in a framework of telling you very briefly the story of Foldscope itself. But I'll keep that short and transition to tell you even further stories more recently on COVID, and with the goal of thinking about what have we actually learned and what does it mean to work as a community together. I think just the overall aspect of this is often enough we think that the tools that we make are the ones that drive much of what happens in the world. And of course, 10 years ago, that is exactly how I thought as well, that the heart of what we do is in our technical innovations. And over the 10 years, what I've learned, which I'll share with you just very briefly, is it truly is, of course, tools play a very important role. The heart of the kinds of change that we want to make in the world really comes from communities. And organically, how do you build a community around your project that is passionate and driven, but is carrying the similar vision as you have, so that they take ownership of these sets of projects in their own hands as well. So this will be a little bit interactive. I'll tell you a few stories, and after every story, I will stop and we will kind of do conversations, because I want you all to share the stories in your lives that you have realized where there were moments where you felt that the type of community engagement that you were able to do actually propel the project forward. And again, I think the more open you can be, our failures are where we learn the most from as well. So it would be phenomenal for somebody to say, hey, this was an open source project that I started that completely crashed. And why did it crash? And what do we need to be aware of from day one? Because our passion here in this class is scale, and our passion is access to everyone. So it would be extremely valuable for all of you to share some of the past stories as well. So let's jump to, oh, go ahead.
For everyone, I think I'm going to give you all permission to unmute yourselves, because currently you can see I'm in a very hot car and my computer is not really overheating. So in case you guys did earlier, I'll give you guys permission to unmute yourselves if that's all right.
Okay, so Tyler has basically let go of control. What that means is anybody can unmute themselves, but please make sure you don't accidentally unmute yourself. Unmute yourself when you want to. Okay, so let me jump into just sharing, firstly, just the story of Foldscope itself. I'll briefly mention the technical side, but really, it's a story of human endeavor more than, I mean, I'm telling my personal view of it as well. And I was looking for some older photographs, and I think along the way I'll kind of find this. Uh, I was starting my lab around 2011 when I first moved to California, and I had spent time at MIT, I'd spent time at Harvard. I had seen access to essentially some of the world's best, if not the best, research facilities. Um, but there was this nagging feeling. I mean, I grew up in India, and it was very clear to me, even at that time, that for science to make progress the way that we want it to make progress requires access. And I was very lucky to make it to grad school. I mean, kind of the personal story is for some other day, but it was very clear that the type of progress that I wanted to see would not happen unless we made tools that would truly be accessible to an average person around the world. Oh, uh, Ilanda, can you mute yourself? Okay, yes, thank you. And the question sort of begins with this, first of all, do we even have the time in our lives to do something like this? Often enough, I mean, all of you are working on scientific, this is only one portion of many things that you're all doing. And the evaluation systems that are built in science are often around, who was the first one to reach a peak of a mountain? uh, and sometimes even understanding the mountain gets secondary. And in that type of an environment, sometimes it's a little bit hard to build open projects where you don't know what that capacity or capability would lead to in the world even. And that was the premise that I was starting as a young faculty, my lab at Stanford. But it was clear to me that I was going to dedicate 50% of my lab's time and our efforts in thinking about this problem. And there are lots of reasons why that was important. But the heart of much of what we wanted to do, even from the very beginning, was really, it's captured in this phrase, magnifying curiosity. And I'll mention sort of why we chose that as a criteria. Uh, that process resulted in Foldscope. And of course, you all know this object very well. But if I can find in my stack of things somewhere, I want to show you guys a picture. And I'm sharing this process because I want you all to sort of have an intuition for where ideas come from and how far they can go from a context of what you see now versus where it existed in the earliest phase. And I am looking at, there is a picture that, I mean, this is definitely one picture, but there is a photograph that I am looking for that. Okay, I will have to keep looking for it. I'll find it in a second. But one of the context of this was the origin of Foldscope actually starts with a matchbox. And I was gonna show you a picture of the very first device that we built, which was built out of a matchstick box. And the history is, I think at that time, Jim was my first and my only graduate student. And I think I had just returned because the lab was not built. I had spent some time traveling, trying to get a sense for what would be the important sets of tools that we want to build. And of course, microscope was one that was an obvious one that I chose to work on. And that happened because of an experience in Thailand, primarily based on a microscope that I had seen that was being used for rabies diagnostics. Rabies diagnostics is still done with fluorescence microscopy. When you get a dog and you want to know, there are certain antibodies you can use. And one of the challenges was we saw this beautiful microscope in the middle of the forest, locked. And the common joke was the man with the key is missing, primarily that, of course, you would lock up and keep those precious instruments, but again, nobody would have access to it. And on coming back, one thing that I'd been thinking about had been matchsticks. And the story of matchsticks is associated with matchsticks are often considered as the one object that a country has to make for them to really get a categorization that they are starting to be integrated. This is an older description in manufacturing processes. And of course, the way we can make large scale manufacturing is through roll-to-roll manufacturing. And so the common onset that Jim and I started on was that we were going to build a type of a process or an instrument that we define the cost and we define the scale of the manufacturing process without knowing whether we would have the capacity to make something or not. And the cost had to be, we set ourselves a target of $1, and we set ourselves, manufacturing, we knew we wanted to do some aspects of flat manufacturing. And then the end result is this object that you see. Jim now, of course, he successfully graduated. Jim and I started an entity outside. But in the middle, there was something very important that we did that most people don't actually know about, which is related to the community. And I'll come back to the optics inside a full scope, but I think I want to focus on the community for a little bit. The realization that we had was, what is the point if we can manufacture microscope? What does that actually do? Does that even do anything? And this is, amongst all the photographs that I've ever taken, this is one of my favorite full scope photographs, primarily because we had a very clear notion for we can manufacture microscopes, we cannot manufacture mentors. What does it, the reason this is my favorite photograph is you can see two parents not giving the microscope to their own child. And, it reminds you of something that's quite interesting, that they themselves are so lost in this beautiful world per se, that they are exploring. And this is how we want the world to be. And that led for us to think about, from a timeline perspective, something quite interesting. So around 2010, we invented Foldscope, we shared it. But around 2012, we started building a program, which at that time we had called a 10,000 microscope project. And the idea of a 10,000 microscope project was literally this. Can we posted on our lab website, I just wrote something along the side that if anybody wants a microscope, you just have to write a two-paragraph description of what you would use it for. And we would literally, from our own cost, just ship you that. There was no ask. There is nothing we wanted people to do for us. We were not trying to define the scientific boundaries or questions we would like people to explore. We just wanted to see what happens to the world if microscopy is accessible. And at that time, I remember having conversations with my colleagues, many of my friends. I mean, it was quite an expensive operation because we hadn't figured out how to make Foldscopes for cheap. So we were still spending a fair amount of money making them. Many a times, Jim and I were building some of these by hand per se as well. But that led to a community, which I think even at that time, we did not appreciate how profound this idea was. We ended up making 50,000 of these instruments in the lab. We built them in lab setting using robots that I don't have the time to show, but at some point I can share those robots as well. And this core 50,000 individuals around the world had incredible individuals that I had never even imagined or dreamed of in my life, that I would get a chance to work with these individuals and help. And many of you are actually, some of you are in this room itself. And when I shared of what I wanted to do with several of my colleagues, it was a sense of confusion because I wasn't pitching some large citizen science project that would lead to some papers that I would write or would lead to some very specific scientific mystery solved, although I knew that there are lots of scientific mysteries we can solve this way. So the question was, why do it? We have written our paper, we have described it, and then, we often hope, and again, this is also a big lesson as scientists that we have to take, that if you have a very clear idea of what you want, the change you want to see, you have to execute on it. And the point was that if we are going to claim that we have built a microscope that only costs $1, we have to prove to ourselves by at least making 50,000 of these. And that led to currently what is now the Foldscope program. At this point, after 6 years or so of doing this, we have released somewhere around 1.3 million microscopes. And first 50,000 of them were released from the lab, and then Jim and I started an entity really focused on manufacturing. And then at this point, after 5 years of work, here we are. The way this map is color-coded is interesting. And there is a color underneath that's quite hidden, which is, I think, in one of the green colors, which was our phase 1 program. And that phase 1 program is what established this community of users around the world. And often enough, now my view of Foldscope and much of the work we do is centered around this community, which many of you are part of. It's not the tool in the end. I mean, of course, the tool is important and these tools will improve, but we were able to tap into a very large mass of curious individuals that were passionate about bringing local change in their communities. So I'm just going to show you a quick video of what that community looks like, and then very briefly transition into what this community has been able to achieve in the last, say, 5 years. So if some of you who haven't seen this community, these were the very first versions of community members that we started training. This is a community of rangers in Kaziranga. And their primary role is to protect the natural environments. And of course, they had never ever seen kind of the context of microscopy. This data set is from a community in Panama, for example. And then I'm just going to see whether, so this is a group that we started working in Madagascar, which led to now UNICEF trying to implement a program across Madagascar. And one of the importance of Madagascar was the biodiversity is so large that it gives us, now this is another group in Tanzania, which was led by Sherry, who's been running youth programs. Of course, now this is going too fast for me to actually tell you each one of these communities. But, this video has a lot of meaning because hidden in these pictures is, now this is another community that's important, which we started in Lebanon, which was focused on refugee kids because the war was going on and most of these kids had not gone to school, and we wanted to explore what does that mean. And again, this was not about just looking outwards, but also inwards as well. These are local schools, for example. So I'm going to stop the video here because I want to share some things on the. So one of the aspects of, if we look back, what were the decisions that we made around community building? There are a few principles that I can think about. One of them is that eventually we were really focused on, we wanted to know what would the users do with these tools, and we did not want to dictate them. And so what becomes important in this perspective is, can you transfer ownership such that the individuals that engage with you are the ones that are in complete control of the types of curiosities that they would like to explore? And now this is not true for all the tools that you're building, but many of the folks, many of you who are building these tools, think of them as windows rather than a prescribed object. But individuals had to have the choice of what would they look at or what would they do. and not dictating it. So this was the first website that we had set up. And I don't know if some of you have seen, if you go back in the history of Microcosmos, look at the posts from 2015. They are some of the older posts. And of course, there has been evolution of the same individual that is engaged in the community for the last 5 to 6 years, and you would see a progression in their thinking. So first principle was to make sure that the ownership of the project and the implementation belongs to the individuals, and we are playing a supporting role. The second aspect of this was top down, which is how can we partner with governments, for example. And so of course, many folks who have joined in and connected from India probably already know this. We started a government program on giving micro grants to any individual as long as they would be sharing that data that they would collect. And this led to a fairly large scale program in India alone. And I'll check if I actually have the picture of that somewhere in my deck. Yeah, right here. So this was a program that we started in India, and this was done with the government of India. And what was very important about making sure that we found a partner that would operate at this scale was we could truly reach communities where you do require partners to get to remote areas per se. And one of the interesting aspects of this program has been, there was a clause that many of the individuals at the DBT said, which I was first really puzzled with. They said that we will have a requirement that for you to join this first program, you will have to partner and physically visit one remote community. And I was puzzled by this because I said, why are you making it so complex for communities to join? And in the end, they were right. Their intuition was that, of course, we all have different amount of access. And so the schools and universities that are in cities and have access, they will pick up very quickly. But by making this twin city program, most of those folks were tied to working with one remote community, which has less resources. And actually what I have seen now over the years, the individuals that participated in this have become real friends to an extent that they are still engaged, although there are no requirement to engage anymore. And then the engagement requirement was around the Northeast, which is a difficult area to get in, and many people have never even visited in India, but has the highest biodiversity. So it was a very clever twist on the program itself, which if I was building the program, I would not have first thought of it myself. The other aspect of this is really around individuals, and then maybe I'll mention, and one individual I want to mention in here, which kind of highlights, this is a story in a story itself, in some sense. One of these individuals is in this picture, which is Mo Pandirajan. He only speaks Tamil. I've met him a couple of times, but I remember when we launched our first 10,000 microscope project, I got this email, which was mostly written in Tamil, and I decided to translate it. And it was a message from Mo, who you can see is the individual at the back right here. He said he was a teacher in a small school of 12 kids, and he wanted to bring science to the kids there. Could we send him some foldscopes? And at that time, I was spending majority of my time actually responding to and sharing aspects with community. So I decided that, okay, we're going to send some units. We sent some units, and then eventually he joined the microgrant program. And then I started to get to know him. And 6 years later, this single individual, this is one teacher in the middle of nowhere, has actually trained roughly around 95 to 100,000 students alone. And when he first told me of these numbers and shared these Excel sheets with every name of the teacher he has trained, the units, I was just a little bit puzzled. I mean, I mean, that's a large number just for even an individual. I did the math. This would require for you to be training 30, 35 kids almost every day for the next 3 or 4 years. And when I was thinking about this, I became Facebook friends with him just to see what was he actually doing. And it turned out that every single day he was running a workshop for 30 or 40 kids. And I feel, the program is really, what we have done with the program is just identify these remarkable individuals who otherwise would never be identified in our system. So I think I'm emphasizing the community aspect of it, because when you broadly explore this, you find remarkable individuals that our systems currently do not support. And there was no way of finding Mo by any other means other than just a random trial. At this point, after English, Tamil is the most spoken language in the Microcosmos platform, only because of this one individual, because everybody else he trained ends up speaking Tamil. And this has become the largest repository of Tamil science content. I mean, it's a language that's spoken by a lot of people, but just the content made by people was not there. And I think it sort of holds in my heart kind of what is the purpose of the origin story of why we did what we did. Of course, there are many examples like this. I just choose to highlight one. This is another picture that Mo sent fairly recently. And literally, he himself invented many programs. And one of the things that he does very often, which you all saw in that, I think in one of these clips somewhere down here, is there is a way that he runs his workshops, and I'm going to try to see if I can find that picture somewhere. Mo invented this idea of, he would go into, so this is another picture from right here. So this picture is very special. What he invented was a way for, first, when he started introducing microscopy in places, it didn't even make any sense. And so he would go and do these exhibits that in a food market, he will hang these pictures with no explanation, like alien objects in the middle of nowhere, while people are buying vegetables. And then people would just get curious and come about and turn it into a conversation. And that's how he would recruit people to engage. And he came up with many tools like this. For example, running workshops in moving trains. When you're traveling, you have nothing to do and you're trying to pass time. It just really creative ways of thinking about what does engagement actually mean. And one of the other threads, and then I'm going to switch to other stories, is what has been really interesting for me to follow and engage in the Foldscope community itself has been, there is a certain set of applications that we can imagine when you are designing a tool. But when you pass the ownership to people, they come up with applications that are completely outside your field of view of what you were thinking about at that time, which is an important aspect of frugal science, because as many of you are thinking about, of course, a very specific problem you want to solve, if the tools that you build are accessible, it'll be very clear that a very broad number of problems should also be solved with the same sets of tools. And you have to let others engage in that process. I mean, this is one example. One thing that comes to mind related to this is in agriculture. There is a large program that is starting now on training farmers on identifying pathogens using a Foldscope. And that is something that earlier on when we started, and again, from a food security perspective, was something that we had never explored in our thinking. It was only the folks and scientists that engaged in that process that they really developed the process around this. Another one, which is quite bizarre and interesting, is identifying fake drugs in the pharmacy world, which is a huge problem. But again, something that we did not think of, but the community member thought of, because there is a kind of a lyophilization process that's used in authentic drugs that cannot be replicated so easily. So using microscopy, they can detect these microbeads because drugs are packaged in microbeads. So that's another example of something like that. Now at this point, there are hundreds and thousands of these examples of very strange places that this tool is used. And much of that really comes from and is driven by the community itself. So, going back to this figure, and of course, many ways that I've gotten to know many of you, has really been around how do we ensure that we are supporting the communities that we are trying to build? But more so, how do we ensure that the sets of communities that you're building has enough crosstalk between them that it's a self-sustainable community? And I think this is moving forward. So for many of you who are thinking about ecological and environmental problems, I'm going to stop sharing this. We're going to turn it into a little bit of a discussion. This is almost an art in some sense that, of course, there are a few guidelines that you have to follow. But if you care about scaling up any of the things that you do, it is extremely important to have an anchor point for what does it mean? What are the sets of rules of engagement? And it develops a culture in the community, which, for example, our culture always was about teaching. So currently, most Foldscope users don't just use their tool for themselves. They are really focused on sharing it and bringing other people into the skill set of what they are doing. So I'm going to stop on this story here and kind of turn this into a brief conversation. If any of you have any questions on the Foldscope side, because then I want to transition and tell you the same thing again from a COVID context, just the power of community. But I'm just curious if there are threads that many of you are thinking about in your own projects where you find it hard to think about the community aspect. So you can either unmute yourself and ask questions or post it in chat. Or many of you have actually built communities, and I would love to hear. So I hear Corinne has a COVID-related story. So Corinne, do you want to just share that? And that'll be a good, actually, let's hold on.
Yeah,
Let me
sure.
ask if there is any other question on the Foldscope side, and then I'll let you share the COVID story, and it'll be a good transition for me to then talk about the COVID stories. Any comments of community building kind of exercises that people have done, either have taught you something along the way? So I see a few questions about the technical bits on the microscopy side. It actually is a very good one. The first Foldscopes that we released and that we built, we actually built things all the way to around 1000x. But usually it used to require a certain, and again, the new versions of Foldscopes we're about to release will have higher magnifications. The next lens is around 450x. But we also noticed that it required the kind of skill, and the jump in perception was too high. Sometimes you couldn't connect the macroscopic to the microscopic with that jump. And since we were going to build the first Foldscope with just one lens, we wanted people to zoom in, but enough that they can stretch their imagination and connect the microscopic to the macroscopic as well. So that was one of the reasons. And of course, the ease of use matters a lot in that. Any other questions on, I'm just curious, has anybody had the chance to build large scale communities, and any lessons they want to share from that? I mean, they can also be in the scientific world as well. They can be in academic world, like many of you as academic leaders have tried to build communities around an idea, and we often don't get to talk too much about it. You assume that you're joining a community, like, for example, the Society of Electron Microscopists, or the ocean societies. I'm just curious if anybody has any story they want to share in that space. Actually, okay, I do have one. I'm going to call upon Mohammed. You guys are quiet today, and I want this to be interactive. Abbas, are you on the line? Mohammed? Mohammed is from Iraq, and he has built a community of a science club in Iraq right after the war ended. And that would be a fantastic story to share. Looks like he's not on the line. Okay, I'll pass this to you, Corinne. Do you want to just share your COVID story?
Yeah, it's actually a community story too. I'll keep it short, but I'm with the biolab Chinampa and Salinas. And at the beginning of COVID, we saw that there was no PPE being distributed all to ag workers, and all the community colleges, all the people helping with the PPE were only sending it to the hospitals. And then finally, when we started to build a community around let's get PPE to the ag workers, we realized that there's different needs in these spaces. So how might we prototype? So we started collaborating with the field workers, the farm owners, the advocacy groups, and the hospitals, like, how might we do this? So I think that was kind of an interesting conversation of going in thinking we're going to deliver PPE, but it has to be designed differently. And we also realized it can't be 3D printing because it's like couture design. It takes so long to print something. It had to be laser cut, had to be fast, had to print in a minute. So it was an interesting journey. And then we learned that each field's different. Every crop is different. There's different winds, different. So how can you design PPE on site was another question. So we're kind of engaged in that conversation.
Yeah, and I think one of the factors there is in the building of the community, you learn and understand the problem that you're trying to solve much better as well. So of course, the community is your tool of delivery, but it is also in the very beginning of the design phase, it is also your anchoring point that can prove or disprove whether some of the ideas that you're thinking about actually work or not. So I'm going to transition to tell a few more stories around COVID. And I know some of you asked for that first picture of full scope. I know I have it in one of my slide decks, but of course, it's always the case that when you're talking, you can't actually find what you're looking for. I will find and post that on Discord in some sense. But let's transition to COVID briefly. And one of the threads that I want to do with respect to COVID is just to tell you a few more stories associated on the people side. And of course, there's a lot of technical content that I'm about to share, but I'm going to de-emphasize the technical stuff because much of the technical stuff you can all actually read as well. And of course, I'm around, so I can talk about that. But I want to really focus this on how do we really, are there lessons to be learned in this context in much of what we can do currently. So the first bit associated with this is this is an interesting perspective that I've been thinking about COVID. So first of all, many of you have been impacted by COVID, and it's been a real horror story just to see, both from a perspective of what has happened, but also from a perspective of lives lost, the amount of stress that the healthcare system has been under, the disruption in education, and of course the economic hardships is all combined together, all coming at the same time. I want to tell a little bit of a hopeful side of this. I don't have to repeat because much of the news already repeats the impact. The hopeful side is embedded in this picture. So on the left is a picture of Carl von Drees. And the interesting bit is he's credited to be the inventor of bicycle. But if you go back and look in the history of this invention, it was primarily invented because there was a gigantic volcanic eruption that caused one of the largest famine in Europe at that time. And horses started dying. And it forced the community to rethink fundamentals of transport. And that led to this transition of thinking about bicycles. And this was the first class of bicycles where he demonstrated that you could efficiently move from point A to point B, of course, with no pedals. And it still took, when the volcano was done, horses came back again. And of course, horses were around for even much longer. But it seeded an idea. And I think the hopeful side of this story is that there is something that we will learn from this pandemic that will allow and enable us to operate much more efficiently, maybe deliver the kind of services we want to deliver to people in a manner that is actually accessible to majority of people on this planet. Uh, and there is something dramatic that I have seen change from the place where I sit, which is the interaction of the scientific community with society at large, scientific community with the industry, and also the role and the principles of science and how important it is to follow them in a time of crisis as well. And I think, many of you sit in many vintage points, so I'm actually quite curious, what are the most dramatic things that you have seen change in your own professions as well related to COVID? Uh, but I'll tell you a quick story of sort of our lab's journey through COVID, and many of you have been involved in that. Uh, this is a cartoon that appeared in a French newspaper associated with some of the work that we have done on snorkeling masks. I know Yves is on the line, and several of you have been engaged in this project. Uh, and this is depicting a postdoc in the lab who has been working on this project for a while. And it's the only whimsical picture I have of COVID. Everything else is quite drab in some sense. In terms of thinking about the class of projects, every one of them has a starting story which is focused around the community. And I think one of the threads that I'll just touch upon for each one of them is something that I would not have predicted of how it would unfold, but there were certain principles that we applied in building communities around these ideas. The origin story of it is much more focused on when everything shut down. It was very clear that many scientists and non-scientists wanted to contribute to fight the pandemic. But of course, you cannot fight a pandemic like this all alone. And there was a lot of sharing of ideas that started to happen. So at that early stage in March, as a lab, we decided to initiate projects in COVID. And the way we did this was slightly different from how we normally do science. Normally, when we open source projects or we share projects, we do them at the end of the project. We share what we have achieved and done. And that seemed backward to me at that time. And so I think early on, we made a decision that for all of these projects, we will initiate some Google Docs that are completely open that anybody can join. And I think this has happened over and over again in many communities that have engaged in COVID, because we were looking for partnerships along the way. And then I'll give you a few examples of each of these projects as they come along. Much of this is documented. And of course, the individuals that are engaged are not just students, they are industrial partners, they are clinicians, they are non-affiliates, and just individual contributors that led to many of these projects scaling in a manner that would not have scaled otherwise. So much of this is documented on these sets of websites. And you can see right here is one example of that open document. I was about to take this document down yesterday, and I thought of left it here just for, because it's not accurate anymore, but I just left it because it gave me a template of what we had done at that time. And I think, there was something associated with this, a language that we wrote that anybody can replicate, anybody can build upon the top of that work. And, just like all of you, we've been on these infinite number of Zoom calls that I'll talk about in the very end when I talk about the specific sets of projects and the history behind these projects. So rapidly, the first one I want to talk about is in the space of mechanical ventilation. And I'll just primarily emphasize the community part of it, because that's what I want to focus on. Early on, it was very clear that we were going to be short of ventilators. There's a phenomenal open source community that sprung open in these automated ambubags kind of approaches. All of that originates to some of the designs almost 10 years ago from Alex Slocum's lab at MIT that had explored this idea. And then eventually they had also explored its limitations as well. But in the time of crisis, this was the fastest route that many people took. We were thinking about this problem, and it occurred that the clinical standpoint, there is so much you can go with an ambubag. You really need the kind of knobs that people require to be able to actually support a patient. And that led to for us to be thinking about much more of a full featured ventilator. Now that was a crazy thought to think about, that in a short period of time we would think about building a ventilator that really does support a clinician. And so there were lots of discussions that we had with clinicians at that time. And when we announced that, we posted the first preprint, and within 2 days, there are two groups that reached out to us mentioning they were thinking about this exact same thing. And literally, they had replicated something that we had been building as well, completely independently. So it was a very obvious match. And that would not have happened if we had not posted that preprint. So it teaches you the power of preprint as well, that if you don't share what you're thinking about, there is no sense of trust that builds in. And that led to primarily a team with 3 universities involved on this project and 4 or 5 industrial partners. At that time, when we shared the preprint, many of the industrial partners felt that although they could not have made the first leap of faith, once we were there as a partner, they had the capacity to manufacture. And they brought in exactly what has been missing on our end, which is how would we scale. But we had that sense of faith that eventually let's just share. And of course, the grounding of all of this was based on that we're going to build an open source full feature ICU ventilator. Long story short, we did actually build this ventilator. There is a lot online that you all can see. But I think I want to emphasize one of these pictures. So if you just go to pesglobo.org and go to updates right here, this is kind of the current state of it's in clinical trials right now. We're just about to start clinical validation in 4 countries. And of course, you can go back and see much of the history of the technical aspect of what happened. But I want to come back to community, which is this picture here. What's interesting about this picture is when we started the design process, we started realizing that there is manufacturing capacity. This was at the time where there was a ban that ventilators could actually not even be exported. And it was very important for us to think of the long-term aspect of this, which is, can we use this moment to engage with partners that have not in the prior learned the process of medical device design, but actually have the capacity to onboard that process. So suddenly the types of entities that joined for the team in Kenya, which is what you can see on the very right, is a biomedical engineer who has been fixing ventilators in Kenya for the last 15 years. So he knows ins and outs of ventilators. And then a partner, which is the Kenya Manufacturing Association, which is they manufacture mostly automotive parts, but did not think about that they could manufacture ventilators. And then an architect and a few other people joined together. And when they saw our preprint, literally in the first round of sets of kits that we started shipping, they validated that. They took it to the board that is associated with the regulatory body in Kenya, because again, the ownership of the project belongs to them. It's they who are implementing it in their country, and we're playing a supporting role. So a similar thing happened in Nepal. So the picture that you see in the middle there is from National Innovation Center in Nepal. It's a remarkable group of individuals that had, when COVID started again, almost fixed half the supply of all ventilators in Nepal were fixed by this group. Again, if you go look at kind of their workspace, it just looks like a giant shed, but just incredibly talented people. And they onboarded the team primarily in the context of then they had the capacity. And again, the kinds of connections and the trust in the community. And then the third partner is a manufacturing partner in India that primarily makes automotive parts and other large-scale manufacturing, but had never done anything related to ventilators, but had a phenomenal manufacturing capacity to an extent that parts that we can't even make here on our campus or even with industrial partners would take too long, they can literally roll out in a day or two. And it led to this really interesting consortium of every country helping each other, parts shipping in from India to Nepal, Nepal to Kenya, Kenya back to us. And we were all part of almost a co-design cycle. And more importantly, many of the clinicians locally could actually engage, which was very important to us because we could design a ventilator that is only operational in the Stanford hospital, and that's not what we were trying to solve. So this is an ongoing project, and one of the lessons that I've learned from this has really also been around capacity building. Can we learn something from this to explore the idea that the capacity that we need in manufacturing is there, but sometimes requires the crossing over that energy barrier to really be able to engage? I'm going to rapidly switch. So this is kind of one demo of that ventilator. So that's a test lung. At the back is the ventilator. And of course, what's happening here is the clinician is really pushing the limits. What he's doing is he's simulating cough. And one of the perspectives of this is, of course, as somebody who's designing ventilators, but if you haven't thought through the process of how many times a patient coughs, you can't actually design that. And it was really, when you really sit down with clinicians, that lead and open up a completely new avenue that you have to be thinking about. I'm going to switch to saying a few words about New Mask, which is a project that we initiated around PPE and reusable PPEs, as Corinne mentioned. There is a huge environmental implication of our mask. You know, the mask that I'm wearing, for example, right now, this mask will take 400 years to degrade, but I'm only going to be using it for 1 day. And, you know, it kind of sets the limits on, and again, yes, they are more protective than many other masks, but on the other hand, for medical folks, the medical grade masks are essential, but they're not reusable. And at an early stage, we started thinking about snorkeling masks. And then again, we did the same thing. We just posted the idea. Actually, this one, I just posted on Twitter. And that led to somebody at Boston Scientific, which is a major medical company, reading that tweet and saying, we will help you get it to the FDA, or we will help you get to manufacturing. We will help you scale. And literally for the next 2 months, we worked with Boston Scientific and Medtronics and their FDA experts and their experts in safety to really be able to deliver the design. And of course, around that time, designers around the world started playing with this idea as well. And then we decided to ensure that how do we make sure that scientifically accurate data is collected and shared in the community. And often enough, that was all driven also by clinicians across the country. So in total, we deployed something like 45,000 or so of these masks around the world. They are completely reusable. And, you know, from a clinician pictures perspective, it's been really a humbling experience in what felt like what the clinicians were doing were literally putting their life on the line, but without the kind of protection that they need. And of course, if you look at the numbers of clinicians that we have lost and healthcare workers that we have lost, it's an astounding number. And for some countries, that number will have an impact on a long period of time. And of course, it sets this, many hospitals were literally shut down because then they just they did not have safe protocols in place, for example. The other aspect of this was, again, on the distributed implementation itself. So I think when we were working on this, the peak was in France, and there was adoption of technology as it happens between the communities itself. And one of the aspects of this was, in terms of team members, the manufacturing folks were in France, the regulatory folks were in the US, the scientific data that we were collecting was in US and Chile, And for many deployments, of course, the deployment was in around 22 or so countries. And again, it is the kind of diversity that we were able to tap in and engage with, without which, you cannot actually deploy a solution per se. And then in parallel, many communities did a similar sets of projects, both in, there are groups in Chile, several groups in Europe, Italy, UK. And it was quite a remarkable experience in terms of the amount of sharing that happened between the projects itself. And I'll mention, maybe I'm going to skip this one and just mention one more project for time's sake, because I also want to share a different side of the story to this, which is much more an academic community itself that came together. So I'll just mention the story of N95 Decon briefly. And of course, the way that I met Tyler is through N95 Decon itself. This was a challenge focused around that there was a lot of information around decontamination that was buried in literature that nobody even knew. On the other hand, there was a panic associated with what types of decontamination protocols should actually be followed. And then there was a lot of silence from the regulatory bodies that we would have thought would immediately come out with something, primarily because they have been swamped and did not have the bandwidth to be able to rapidly respond. And that led to an NGO, which was focused around, academics first, as both students, faculty across 15 or 16 universities. We came together with literally a daily huddle, trying to bring essentially clarity, first of all, in this entire space, but also sense of trust, because one of the challenges is somebody has to look through much of the documentation in a manner and an entire system of peer review that we built internally that allowed the sense of trust to be shared. And I think this has been a remarkable example personally for me, because that many number of academic groups working together round the clock is something that I had never seen. I know it's possible because, when you look at the high energy projects, and many projects in particle physics are all done with, 50 or so groups around the world. But just personally, I had never experienced that. And again, the principle of community building, one of the things that was obvious to us early on was that there would be no hierarchy. As contributors, people can come in, they're volunteers, they can come in and go. Of course, based on scientific principles, we could debate as much as we want, but it was not around a structure of hierarchy, and it was a flat structure. And, there has been experiences that both students have been able to share in this community that have been very powerful. And actually, one thread on that is, I don't know, Tyler, if you're on the line, I'm curious, as an individual who's been an integral part of this community, what has your personal experience been? It would actually be valuable for people to hear.
Yeah, for sure. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry for the background noise. I'm outside now. It's much cooler. But no, I think you put it really beautifully. N95 Decon was something really. I think it was kind of for me, it's sort of been like the dream of what science can be. Because I think quite often, everyone, like as an idealistic kid, I was thinking, hey, science is purely objective. Everything is purely based on scientific fact, and policy should be, created based on the facts that are, that you can see by experiment. When in reality, you see quite often that's not the case. And having this group come together, I think it was really amazing. One beautiful thing about this is that it was a group of people who were not actually, a lot of us initially were not experts on decontamination. And in fact, I think that actually ended up being a benefit to the group because people didn't come in with preconceived notions of, what should this look like? What is the quote unquote best method of decontamination? People were not attached to their ideas for any personal reason. It was really, ideas were there for the sake of figuring out which is going to help save the most lives. And I thought that was something that was really, really exciting. And I think something that taught me a lot, that, you know, when you have a group of people and you can just define specifically, our goal is to, regardless, like, we don't care about whose idea wins. We're very democratic. Everyone shares everyone shares the credit and everyone shares the failures, right? So being able to say our goal is to reduce the number of lives lost and put out the most valid scientific information, that I think led to something that was really, you know, from talking to folks, has been, you know, actually like super useful to a lot of people around the world, which was really, really cool to see.
And I think one of the threads that happens is, with a sense of a community, there is both an internal trust, but then there was an external trust, because slowly, when we were able to share our process with other folks, the type of content that the group could generate could then be trusted. And of course, many folks reached out to us in terms of being able to request clarity. And this is much more of an active engagement, again, a process of community building, which is, there were node points. For example, one individual that I'll highlight here is Nicole. She's not on this picture here, but an individual that has worked with community, and actually she's one of the mentors. Nicole, you're not on the line, are you? Probably not. She's way too busy saving lives. But again, she acted as, I mean, beyond the technical expertise, as a nodal point of connecting us as a community with many of the other communities that actually needed this information urgently around the world as well. And so as you are thinking about building a community around your project, you will stumble upon individuals that truly act as that connection point, because that connection point is incredibly important. Because much of what we often think and feel is, so much knowledge is locked in documents and the products of what we make, but in the end that has to get out, and sometimes that bridging that gap is often hard, and you have to find these nodal individuals. And I think, to me, Nicole was that type of a nodal individual that led to a lot of threads. And of course, everybody's been focused on that, but often enough you will find that there are certain individuals that are connected in these communities on a longer basis. So I want to
one other quick thing,
ahead,
Manu, if I could just jump in.
Yeah.
One, actually, while you're talking about that, that reminded me. I think another huge takeaway that I got from that was that, you know, in the 95 decon process, I think, yeah, Nicole absolutely was like instrumental in getting us to these other communities. But even so, none of that would have happened if the things that we were offering were not actually useful to these people. And I think, like, through Foldscope, through all of these, I think the key of any of these projects, like, there are lots of projects, especially, you know, in Stanford and Silicon Valley, there are lots of projects, people make something and then they try to sell their product, or they try to sell something to someone. I think nothing should be sold. Things should be created that
so
are useful enough to people. Exactly. That you can say, we have this information. Is this useful to you? And if people say, no, this is not useful, then you ask why, and ask what other information you can provide. And we did that through some of our webinars, and we found that over the course of time, those webinars became more and more useful to people. So even today, you know, we're still looking at communities that are missing this information and are still asking for new content and the ability to answer certain questions about the pandemic. So I think creating something that is really useful is actually the key.
And I mean, I think one of the learning process here is the push versus pull analogy. And this is why I had emphasized the idea that for all the projects that you're all building, it's extremely important for you to anchor yourself in a community, howsoever small it is, that you are trying to engage and help, who will actually be the users. And if you start with the users, howsoever small that user group is, it will be something that you would be designing for those sets of individuals in mind. And again, you can expand, but every one of these examples, you can take a factor of what it means from a user perspective. I want to mention one last word on COVID and really turn this into a much broader discussion. There are several other sets of projects, including there is a ramp up right now that we are doing on home diagnostics that I can talk about. There is a certain amount of work that is happening in manufacturing of PPE from a distributed manner in the future. But I think I'll leave those for other days because I want to really turn this into a discussion, but I want to open the discussion with this picture. To me, I mean, of course, COVID is not behind us. I strongly believe COVID is not behind us. It is here. As you look at the third wave that we are seeing, and again, many of you are literally living through this, we have seen the tip of the iceberg, but there is a lot hidden, especially in the context of what really happens when even the sets of vaccines or tools will become available. Who would they become available to? And that aspect is not a solved problem in any way. And one of the things to highlight is just the fact that eventually, if there is not the kind of collaboration that we can imagine that's distributed and international, many of these sets of solutions will just not be available to a significant portion of people. And of course, the impact of the disease can vary from region to region, and there's lots of genomic and spatial differentiations on how hard it hits many communities. But it's been very interesting to see of how the conversation has shifted because primarily it's been some time now. And of course, that makes it difficult to have that kind of focus for such a long period of time. So I think the reason I want to mention this is many of you, as you're thinking about the tools, your tools are being implemented in a very strange time. We are in this time of a pandemic, and while you'll be rolling out your projects and ideas, this background of COVID will always be in there for the next year or so even. So with that as a background, I want to turn this into conversations, comments, prioritizing first the sets of folks who have had the chance to build communities if they want to share insights, but also just turn this into a broader conversation. If somebody has an idea for their project, but kind of think that how do I go about and explore what does it mean, you can bring that as a question as well. But yeah, let's open this to conversation. So any of you could raise your hands or just ping, or since you can unmute yourself today, you can just speak. That is the superpower that you have today. Use it. Deborah.
Hello.
Yes.
Hi, I'm a research software engineer working in open source development. So this is also a big community, and I thought I would share something
Yes.
that I learned there. So when I started, I did open source development in my free time. I did interactive graphics and things like that. And in the whole Linux open source world, there are many white guys mostly, where it's sometimes hard to feel welcome. And in the open frameworks community, where I started to become active, there was an event where they really took care that it was a more diverse field, and I felt welcome, and I decided that open source is something that I want to do primarily. And then I had 2 kids, and that stripped away all the free time that I had. And then I realized that open source development is mostly done by people who have free time. And this is a big thing because it excludes many people. And I had the privilege to find a job where I can do that, but many people just can't. So, and I think about that often, because there are probably many people who have great experience and would love to also do open source development. But there's also maintenance is a big part. So you cannot really just come for a hackathon and then be out when you build something, and it's really difficult. And then how do you do that? I don't know. I'm just trying to advocate for jobs in this field. But
yeah, I think
I'm also happy
the way that I would put this is sustainability of an idea is almost essential. Without that, you are, whether you like it or not, you are in a marketplace, and of course people have to be supported. And it's very important to be that, even at the start of a project, that being very clear. And I think it is feasible to build models that allow us to share broadly and still be supported in many ways. And at that same time, I think I absolutely agree with you of this notion that, oh, only if you have free time, then you can engage with open source project, narrows down the kind of people that can engage. And this is why starting with the problem you're trying to solve is much more important. And open source is one of the tools amongst many other principles that we need to apply as well. Because
Yeah,
in the
that's what
old
I
days,
also got now. Yeah.
yeah, in the old days, the quality could be associated with, and again, there's a big discussion right now, which we're grappling with ourselves, is like, is it even the right framework to have open source critical medical devices? And some arguments are for it, and there are some arguments against it, because unless you can ensure the safety and security, which requires money to be able to do the kinds of tests, because anybody can release a tool, but what about validation processes? And again, it really sets the bounds. And so this is why the solving the problem in a sustainable manner that actually feeds on the human, supports the human souls as much as supports the broader cause is very important. And again, I mean, of course, the diversity bit is just the most important, because we know without that you can't actually solve the right problems.
Yeah, I've also actually seen that so I'm using a system that controls my pump. It's like a do-it-yourself system that also established completely around the people who actually are diabetics and who use it. And it's a completely different community. Like this is the people who need it and who then also just find the aim to work on it because their lives depend on it. And I think it's great if the solution can incorporate people's jobs as well. That was maybe the one point.
Other comments, and I think, I mean, that was a brilliant insight. Other comments on people's engagement in communities.
And I'm seeing a great question in the chat about the economic sustainability of the projects that you talked about today. Do you want to touch on that?
Yeah, I can definitely talk about that. I think with Foldscope, we have always asked ourselves this question, that we don't want to depend on charity. We care about the idea of making these sets of tools accessible. And of course, that sets the price point. But the way that we made Foldscope sustainable was primarily that any regular Foldscope anybody can get for $1.75. But then there's these other products that we make that cost around $25 or $30 that actually support 20 or so Foldscopes. So the basic Foldscope is sold at cost and sometimes at a loss, but primarily, and that's the maximum number of units that go out. But even a small portion of the units can actually support much of that operation. And then, of course, the other aspect of sustainability and the economic sustainability of this is partnerships. So when we engage with larger scale governments and larger scale deployments, it's not the cost lower down, because then the distribution channels that we are using are very different. So we are now thinking quite a lot about local manufacturing. So one exciting bit is we are setting up a plant for manufacturing of Foldscopes in India, because the cost of shipping is just so high that it kills everything in terms of thinking about that economic benefit that you would gain by making a low-cost product. And then, of course, quality is another important aspect of this, which is from the paper, anybody can manufacture and build their Foldscope, but it's very important in optics to be thinking about quality. And how do you bring quality into products as well as low cost? And that comes from automation. So much of the reason that we have been able to make Foldscope sustainable is really just robotics. There is a gazillion robots involved in every step of the way. And again, we keep designing more and more of them to make that process scale up. And again, robotics is one place that you can also think about in terms of when you're thinking about scaling up, which has implications to economic sustainability as well. For many of the other projects in this early stage, it's very hard to say. For example, pufferfish, I've just run out of money right now. So I am now looking for philanthropies to support that phase one of the project because it's going to be an open source reference design that anybody can replicate. For several of the other projects like NewMask, we could only reach a certain number, and after that, financially, unless we had implemented larger scale models, and again, especially responding to the pandemic is hard because the need exists now, but in 2 months from now, nobody knows whether that need will exist. So it's harder to make sustainable implementations for pandemic response, primarily for that reason as well. Yeah, I think those are a few thoughts. Yeah.
One random question on that for NewMask. Do you think that if this had been structured as a for-profit kind of thing, do you think you would have had more or less ability to deploy, like in terms of just absolute number of masks?
Yeah, I think in terms of, we actually explored that, and somebody in the team early on who was part of the team ended up actually starting a for-profit entity. And in the end, the reason eventually that we were able to deploy even the versions that we were able to deploy is because of the transparency around the process. And many of our manufacturing partners that were engaged were also incredibly transparent, and they knew what we are responding to, and hence were able to provide the kind of tools. There is a sense of trust when there is transparency. So it's not about for-profit or not profit, it's about transparency. I think when it comes to that, because again, we have to also be transparent about these sets of tools have not gone through the same level of medical rigor that other tools have gone through. And when you start building, and again, the way that we have built pufferfish is around that. I think the model that we are trying to explore in this space is the model of browsers. So I don't know if many of you know the Chromium browser that was the original browser that Chrome is then based on. Now Microsoft has another browser that's based on it, which is that the reference designs are the ones that are open and accessible and are supported by philanthropy. And then turning those reference designs into products, which those products have the sets of features that you do need to implement sustainably, are the ones that they are based on this big reference design, but then they have sustainable local structures around it, like the company in India, the company in Kenya, the company in Nepal have to support themselves to be able to do this and would require money raised. So those are all for-profit companies, but they could not have done it without this reference design. And how, as a community, can we invest in enough infrastructure to have reference designs that then, so it's a hybrid model in some sense. And the hope is that eventually, if any of these entities succeed, they could support the reference design buildup as well, possibly, which as we're yet to see. And I think, yeah, that always comes back to the transparency in this space is what's most important.
Awesome, thank you.
Other comments. I think there was a question of what kind of cost would you project for pufferfish? I think we are targeting something like literally in our current sets of scenarios, if everything that we are doing succeeds, a ventilator, an ICU ventilator that could be even from a bill of materials be around $200 to $500, because all the sets of parts are built from completely different supply chains. So, I think the next set of a ventilator that comes anywhere close is around $10,000. And then, of course, the local innovations would further drive the cost down, because again, it's a function of numbers, and pandemic is not the only time you use the ventilators. Ventilators are still needed for many other things as well. I do want to hear from some of you, just like what Deborah had said about your engagement in communities in the past. I think it would have been phenomenal to hear about Engineers Without Borders, because that is, again, a community, but I know Pat had to leave today, so he's not online anymore. Actually, Rico, do you want to say a word about Fab Lab as a community? Because clearly you're part of that community. And what lessons have you learned from that community in the last many years?
What lessons have I learned? Well, I'll start off with a punchline, which is it was so influential on me that I quit my securities investment job of 20 years to pursue a new course of life that is about community building and sharing. Somebody was asking earlier about with software and these kinds of proprietary products, how do you maintain economic sustainability? I think it's difficult. I mean, when you live in a context of capitalism, the priority is always to think about yourself and how you can profit from the things that you do. But this concept of open source or the Fab Lab takes on a completely different starting point, whereby, okay, let's assume that community building and sharing is the paradigm. Is there a way to exist in this type of world? And I think it is possible. You know, Fab Lab is not only about learning how to use laser cutters and 3D printers, but to create projects that can be open source and shared. And if you're benefiting from open source projects that somebody else is doing, and then you're contributing, everybody wins, and everybody can learn to make the stuff that you need in your life instead of purchasing it and contributing to the capitalism paradigm. Is that enough?
Yeah, no, that's fantastic. And I absolutely love the opening. This is really the reason why we build these communities. And I think, you know, if Mohammed Abbas was here, he would have said some things of course changes that happen. And again, you know, this is why we all do this. Okay, so it's 1:57. I'm curious. Yeah, go ahead, Subir.
Hi. So I wanted to just hint a bit about air pollution monitors I built in the city of Pune. We built 5 of these. We were very excited, and that's why we built it. And exactly not depending on anyone to fund it. So it's our own money. And because we were excited, we did it. The one thing that we realized is that it didn't work out well. It's still the monitors are working. It's been 1 year. They are giving information every day, every 10 minutes. It puts on information. But the problem is that these monitors require servicing. They require someone to go there and do that. And for that, we need the community. And the problem which we realize is that the community, unless and until they themselves are actively taking part in, you know, some physical form, it's not getting traction. So even if the data looks good, but data is not important unless people get a chance to handle the machine or whatever, participate in it in some ways. That's what I wanted to share.
Yeah, so I think the word that I would use for that is participatory science. And somehow they need to feel they are really integral part of this entire process as well, for them to be the ones building. I mean, you know, just like we take for granted that our roads are built, but if you feel like as a community member, I get a chance to be part of this and take ownership, and their voice is heard. This is the other part that I wanted to emphasize, which you have to build platforms in which there is a distributed mechanism for people to be able to raise their voice and share how they feel about what you've been thinking about. That's a beautiful example. But Subir, on a positive note, I would say don't give up, because these are experiments. You know, just like science, community building is an experiment, and it doesn't take off in the first time. You just post something and then it's done. I mean, every programmer could tell you that. But there's something quite special with hardware projects and the difficulties associated with hardware projects. Hardware scale up is not the same as posting your code. But again, I think this is what we are all here trying to figure out as well together. And there is lots of lessons we can learn.
Thank you.
Anybody else? I mean, that was just such a beautiful story. Anybody else has one last story they want to share? Okay, so it's 2 o'clock. We will meet next week. Starting next week. Oh, John, were you going to share something?
Yeah,
Go ahead.
I don't know if this is really a great example of community project, but this is to do with motorsports. So when I was working in this is a really proprietary system. There is nothing that comes or goes out of it. It's not really accessible to a lot of people. So the problem is mostly when we build these products for motorsports teams, we expect that something comes out of it that we can apply to something that goes on the road, accessible to common people. But the problem is people who do the testing, the actual riders, the actual racers, the teams that build these racing machines, they really don't know why they're doing it when it comes to specific products like tires. So we do a lot of bench test, make a lot of models, and then go and ask them. The final results come from their verbal feedback. So it's more like we are trying to put numbers to what they are feeling and saying. So they feel a disconnect with what we do in the research industry, plus to what they actually feel on the road. So it's so we actually need them to talk to each other, figure out and get basic common terminology for what they're feeling on a corner. So this is something that people like when you talk to them, they just use their own feeling, their own words. They don't have, there's no common terminology. So so when I was working on this, I was able to kind of bring people in my age group. So 20, 25, I mean, guys in this age group, we just started talking by the track, and I could give them a lot of technical insights, and they would share a lot of their experiences, and then we would find some common terminology that we could use it. We could use in conversations. So this is an example. I mean, I don't know. It's not really a community project, but in a way, it's a in a small proprietary community. Yeah.
No, I mean, it's still a community. And again, you're trying to understand who you are building this for. And the language often is a big disconnect. If you're not talking the language of the individual who's on this, what I understand from your description, the motorcycle, and if the language doesn't exist, you have to come up with the language. I mean, all citizen science projects have to deal with this. Like when you're describing and building a project, but you're not providing the support for the community to really be able to describe what they're doing in their own framework, then you're not reaching. I mean, then it's not really clear whether they will ever be able to provide you the kind of data with the accuracy that you need as feedback. I mean, and we're dealing with the same thing with Emmanuel and Columban in the oceans context, is we have to talk the language of sailors and have them understand the depth of how complex the planktonic system is. If the two things don't match, then they're just the carriers, and they're just a transaction point, which is not what we want. We want them to be ambassadors. And I think, majority of the time is spent on what you just described, is to make sure that the community you're building deeply appreciates and understands the context of the whole story. Okay, on that note, we've run out of time. Oh, Sheetal, go ahead.
Okay, quickly, I would just, I just wanted to share 2 points. So I think maybe around 10 years back, I started a small, it was not a project as such, but I just wanted to create an awareness among kids about the waste management and come up with composting so that they could have some hands-on experience and play around to understand what biocomposting means and how they can use household trash. But so initially I could gather all the kids in the apartment that I stayed. And I came up with initially showing few videos on YouTube and understand the problem of how big this waste management is. So it ran for a couple of weeks, but I also took help of many elderly people who would organize and take care of the apartment stuff. And so we also tried to build a compost as well. And it ran for about 3 to 4 months, I would say. And after that, I had to move to another place, so I couldn't maintain it. But I did hand over the responsibility. But then there was no enough support, and yeah, and people lacked that eye to see that this is for a greater purpose than rather than terming it as a social cause or something. So that was also a failure, I would say. But yeah, I didn't knew how to take that, because I thought that bringing that curiosity in kids would inherently change the behavior also in the parents or in the neighboring surroundings.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's a beautiful story. And again, I think it's it reminds us of also we are all humans, and as we're designing these sets of solutions, these are the really difficult reasons why things don't work sometimes. That intuitively for us, it would just be obvious that if this existed, voila, and it's not true. And I think those are the hardest ones to actually navigate around. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna say bye. I think this community conversation, we will continue. And then next week, we will have classes that are divided up for teams. We will use the class time really for kind of pushing on the projects per se as well. So I'll come up with a structure of rooms. There will be a health room, environmental room, and kind of the bins that we divide up, oceans room, and then we will have internal conversations in those rooms progressing everybody's projects. So we'll kind of categorize all projects into 4 or 5 of these rooms, and every room will have few mentors, and we will jump in back and forth as well. So starting next week, there's going to be a lot of juggling and Zoom gymnastics, as I said. So get ready for that. And then good luck with the projects, and see you next week. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. See you next week.